We running? Are we running? Yeah, we're running. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for showing up. What a wonderful turnout. So this is the first live recording of the Econ Route podcast. Very exciting to have an audience for once, also a little bit scary. So do please be aware that you're on tape, right? So the plan is, after a few introductory remarks, we will use roughly 1 hour to debate, the three of us, mainly Dan, our guest today, which I'll introduce in a moment. And then we'll open up for Q&A from the floor. And when you ask a question, please feel free, but remember that a question ends with a question mark. You learned that in preschool, so please remember it now as well, right? And also state your name. So one other part of housekeeping is we have had a bit of break in the Econ Route podcast, but we do have some wonderful interviews lined up that will be coming out very shortly with some very interesting international scholars, including Chris Coyne, a colleague of yours from George Mason, on peace, which is very interesting and unfortunately very relevant right now. Beside from that, and those should be coming out around Christmas, the first ones at least. So today we're going to be talking about Adam Smith, since he's turning 300 this year, or turned 300 this year. And to help us with this conversation, we have a distinguished guest today. Welcome, Professor Daniel Klein. You are Professor of Economics and Ginn Chair at the Mercator Center at George Mason University. You lead the Smithian Political Economy program, and you're chief editor of a wonderful journal called Econ Journal Watch, which is very fun to read, very interesting. You hold degrees from George Mason University and New York University. You have published research on policy issues, including toll roads, urban transit, auto emissions, credit reporting, and the Food and Drug Administration. You have also written on spontaneous order, the discovery opportunity, the demand and supply of assurance, why government officials believe in the goodness of bad policy, and the relationship between liberty, dignity, and responsibility. Wow, that is impressive. You are the author of Knowledge and Coordination, A Liberal Interpretation, as well as co-author of Curb Rights, a Foundation for Free Enterprise and Urban Transit, and co-editing a couple of other works, including your latest product on, or the latest project, which is a series of essays on classical liberal tradition in various countries. Very interesting indeed, including Denmark. So very happy to have you join the show. Your regular host is, as always,
Otto.
And me, Stefan. So let's get right into it. The first question we'll debate, Dan, is what would Adam Smith think of modern Christmas?
They prepared me, so I've thought about this. And Christmas is certainly a time of a spirit of love, and a spirit of love is certainly Adam Smith. In the theory of moral sentiments, he teaches that all moral approval, every moral approval, relates to a sympathy, and sympathy is like love. I mean, love is a special kind of sympathy. So I think Adam Smith is a very Christmassy guy. Now you ask, what would he think of our modern Christmas? And, you know, what would Adam think of our modern anything? That's like a big question. Surprise, shock, disappointment. You could make cases for all of those. But I thought I would say this. Our modern Christmas is not that devout. And we are, many people are not that devout. But at Christmas time, we think of a beholder who knows if you are sleeping, who knows if you're awake, who knows if you've been bad or good, and be good for goodness sake. And Santa Claus is super knowledgeable, like the impartial spectator in the highest sense of the term. He's benevolent. In fact, he's universally benevolent to everybody. And furthermore, he is beneficent, not just benevolent, but beneficent in giving the ones who've been good anyway, presents. So he's quite a godlike being. And the impartial spectator, who's very important in this book, who is God or perhaps a godlike being, and a universal being, a universal beholder of humankind, plays a central role in that. Our conscience is a representative of the impartial spectator, so we're all kind of relate to each other. That's the spirit of love. So Santa Claus, in a way, is our backdoor way of getting around religious, don't do anything religious. Oh, we got Santa Claus. and that's good because he's a very godlike being when you think about it. Super knowledgeable, benevolent, and even beneficent. So, I don't know, maybe he'd like it for Santa Claus at least.
Lovely.
Well, it's interesting that perhaps the most famous quote about from Adam Smith is about the brewer and the baker, and how we when we want our dinner we appeal not to their beneficence but to their own interest, not self-interest but own interest. But in the theory of moral sentiments, we see not Santa Claus, but somebody who is pretty close, the impartial spectator, and we try to appeal to others. We are motivated by love and something like that. Is there a tension in Adam Smith, in your view, of the moral philosophy?
There are all
and the
sorts of
economist?
interesting tensions and paradoxes, I would say. And part of the challenge, I think, is to explore those and try to resolve those. And it's pretty remarkable how much Smith scholars are still debating these things. I think a lot of Smith scholars, I think, get Smith wrong in some pretty important ways. So the debate, goes on. Which I think is a testament to him, right? Because he wrote in this deep, rich, provocative way, and we're still talking about, hey, we've got so many people here to hear about Adam Smith. I mean, he must have done something right. Now, just to follow up on your brewer and the baker, there's different sorts of sentiments and modes of interaction appropriate to different sorts of problems and situations, purposes. And for a lot of more intimate family and other relationships, benevolence plays a huge role. All sorts of shared feeling plays a huge role, entering into each other's situation. But that's not necessarily the best way to get your lunch prepared, right? And to get your groceries in the cupboard at home. And he taught in this that in a great society, as he called it, the modern commercial society, rendering benefit by making bread and selling it to people without any super strong feeling of benevolence towards your customers is virtuous, because it is rendering benefit, and to the beholder, the great beholder, Santa Claus, God, you can come up with other names, that is beautiful. And so you are serving indirectly that benevolence, even though benevolence is not necessarily part of your day-to-day sentiment, as you go to the market or when you go to the job.
Awesome. So how much would you say the first book, Moral Sentiments, is mainly a descriptive work?
This question comes up: is this descriptive or prescriptive? I guess I would say both.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I would say that he's got a way of doing things which maybe should make us think that distinction is not that deep, doesn't hold that much water. If I ask you, Stefan, describe to me what will be beneficial, aren't you prescribing that?
True. Yeah, I see that.
Or if I say, were antibiotics beneficial to humankind, that's descriptive.
Yeah.
But we all kind of presuppose that we're for benefits for humankind. So, there's a way to turn prescriptive into descriptive and vice versa pretty easily when you think about it, since we all are engaging in these conversations, engaging in scholarship to serve human purposes.
So to stay on this a little bit, if this is okay also. So I love Moral Sentiments, but it's a hard book to read for a casual English reader because he uses a 17th century type language, right? So is this mainly a question of the fact that to Smith, this distinction would not make that much sense. Like he's literally using an English that is different from what we use today, right? In many sense, and how he uses words like conduct versus behavior and these kind of things.
Yeah, I think that's true. That it is pretty different when you start reading it, but it's not foreign. And he's really rich in concrete illustrations. He likes to illustrate what he's saying with concrete examples and stories and illusions. So you get a nice feeling, and you kind of figure out what he's getting at sometimes from his illustrations. So I encourage people to try to read it. There's a lot of loveliness in it. But sometimes it is a rather mysterious and difficult, I have to admit, especially this one, I would say.
Yeah. Wealth of Nations is easier, I think. It's more straightforward. Yeah. Until you get to the point about the corn laws and all that kind of thing. It becomes very tedious.
Yeah, that's another thing.
But you don't see him as, I guess many would see him as a moral philosopher who moved on, who discovered economics and then turned in another direction. And if they look for the impartial spectator or sympathy, or even a reference to the theory of moral sentiments in the Wealth of Nations, they will look in vain. Why is that? Or
I don't think he moved on. But you are right in like everything else you said, and it's almost remarkable. The word spectator appears at the very beginning of the first volume and at the very end at the second volume. And that's the only two times the word spectator occurs in the whole book. And I don't think that's an accident, by the way. The word sympathy doesn't appear at all, which is rather amazing. So you're right that there's this very striking differences in the language used, and I'd say the feeling, a lot of the feeling. There's all sorts of metaphors of music and synchronicity. In this, about sharing sentiments, about sympathy, about beating time together, entering into each other's situation, and so on. And there's not so much at all of that here. So there is a striking difference, but I think it's all part of his master plan, frankly. And indeed, in 1759, when the first edition of this came out, this first edition was 1776, he announced an intention to write a book like this. So I don't think he just, stumbled into that some years later and got the idea then. He seemed to be bent on doing it, right? See, moral philosophy in his day was distinguished from natural philosophy. Natural philosophy was stuff like Newton, astronomy, physics, chemistry, geology. That's natural. And moral in a way just means human conduct. So it's human. So it's all the social sciences and humanities. And to him, I think he sees it all as moral philosophy, and this stuff on political economy, how the economy works, and government policy towards society, that's all underneath this umbrella. So it's not like, he did this, and then he went on and did this. It's more like this, I'd say.
Interesting. So to challenge that a little bit, Smith was a special character. We can say that, I think, right? Apparently, if you read his biographies and so on, how much is this moral sentiment written to him as a guide to how to be human and normal, whereas this is probably written to policymakers, right? Do you get what I'm saying at, or am I being too harsh on him now?
I don't know that it's harsh, but I don't think that's contrary to things I've suggested. Really, this is more about normal human life. This is more about kind of equal to equal, you and your neighbor, you and your family member, you and your coworker, your friends, and how morals works and what's virtuous. I mean, in a sense, this is a book about virtue, and it's discussion of a lot of virtues. this is the virtue of the legislator,
Yeah.
the science of a legislator. So they have to be virtuous too. You know, there's no invisible, or there's very little or weak invisible hands in politics. So we got to hope that there's virtue in politics. Otherwise, we're absolutely something. So it's all a project of virtue. It's just that this is directed towards the policymaker, if you want to call it that way. Call it that. I would say this is also directed to you and your life in the economy, because it is endorsing this pursuit of honest income. It's saying, it's giving like God approves, like go for honest income. Like if you want to increase honest income, God approves. I would say that's a major lesson in this, and more so than it's hinted at here. It's consistent with this, but it's not developed in this.
Interesting.
Interesting. How original do you think that Smith was? You could come across the view that, well, he started out as a moral philosopher, perhaps based himself on ideas of his teacher Francis Hutcheson, perhaps David Hume. Then he goes to France and he comes across a lot of economic ideas. So then he picks up some of those, but not really doing something original, or doing or mainly doing something which is not original, but sort of building on other people's ideas. But you're portraying as having a project which is is connected and thought out from very early on.
Yes, I think you're right that as far as the idea that markets work, there's mutual gains and there's a spontaneous order and there is virtue in pursuing honest income. French thinkers were definitely on that too early, let's say in the 50s and 60s.
And that would be the 70s, 50s, and 60s, just to...
Yeah. But he was... First of all, I think he was reading pretty widely, so he was perhaps even reading their stuff in those earlier decades. But his lectures on jurisprudence from the early 1760s show that he's very much on that track, clearly, really clearly. So the idea that like he had to go to France, he actually went to France just after giving those lectures, to learn that ever since we got those lecture notes, they surfaced, we kind of realized that Smith didn't learn it in France. But what's original here? That's a good question, and I'm not necessarily the most qualified person to address it. But there is what's something quite amazing, and which you certainly can't say about any of the 18th century French economists, is that there's a sort of comprehensiveness and systematicness to it that, if you're going to say, oh, you should really have this presumption in favor of letting, as he puts it, letting every man pursue his own interest his own way, kind of like, because in most cases, you need to look at most cases. You need to think about all these different areas of public policy, and this is really very comprehensive in that way and systematic. So it is original, at least in those senses. This, I think, is original in certain ways too, even though you cite Hutcheson and Hume, who are very important influences. But I do, and I think he's very close to both of them, especially Hume. But I do think he develops on Hume. I don't so much think he collides with Hume. Some people like to drive wedges between Hume and Smith, and I don't really believe in that. I think Hume would smile, or did smile, on the developments of his friend.
So just a little note for the listeners. The first book that was talked about was Wealth of Nations, and then we got moved on to more sentiments. We have to remember to mention which book for the people listening. Anyway, so let's move on. Let's stay a little bit with the period. So now it's said that the French people weren't that important to him. But there was this thing called the Scottish Enlightenment. You talked about Hume and Hutchinson and so on. So I would like to know, how unique do you think the Scottish Enlightenment was? Because we have similar ideas other places in Europe as well. There's a French guy, Anders Kuhnius, I think he was called. It's a Swedish guy, Swedish
Yeah.
guy in Stockholm, who says a lot of the same thing, not as structured, but around the same time. So, what was unique about the Scottish Enlightenment, and was it unique?
I think it's quite special, and I'd have to say unique, even though Chydenius and others, like the French guys, were coming across with strong, good free market insights, for sure, and other civil liberty influences about free speech from Chydenius and so on. So that's a really big question, and again, I'm not necessarily the most qualified person, but it's obviously something I've thought about a lot. I think the 18th century is pretty special, to tell you the truth. I think the whole arc from the printing press, Christianity, the printing press, I think Britain's island geography is an important part of the story, actually. And then I also think that the dissolving of the Scottish Parliament in 1707 is part of the story, because it kind of leaves the cultural landscape in Scotland more open to the intellectuals, like these guys we've been mentioning, rather than always, feeling the pressure and the needs of the political class, who are now down in Westminster, at least as far as the parliamentarians go. And so it kind of opens things up.
So you're saying freedom from practical politics leaves you free to think about real policy.
In this case, yeah. In this it's a very interesting thing, and I think, I think very highly of Britain, of England, but then the Scots are kind of like the cherry on top, at least at this time. They managed to have a cultural centers, especially in Edinburgh and Glasgow and other universities, but those two would be the leading. And those were like mountain tops in the culture, if you like, cultural topology of European culture. And remarkably, guys like Smith and Hutchison rose to the top. They were first among their peers, and their peers were one of these mountaintops. And it was just like this cresting of this liberal arc that I would say comes out of these centuries, actually, in a remarkable way. We had a liberal, and it's part of a liberal era we had.
So are you then also saying that the big English universities at the time, Oxford and Cambridge, were more conservative, more minded towards the establishment, or what would you say this?
Yeah, they certainly.
There's a competition argument here as well, right?
A competition
between institutions. There's a institutional competition argument here, or am I mishearing you?
Yeah, I suppose there was. I don't think they shined nearly as much in these decades. And Smith, in fact, criticizes Oxford very heavily in here.
He does.
In ways that ring true today in terms of our modern leftist universities and the way they fail. There's very strong parallels. It was quite remarkable. I don't really know. I mean, we were lucky, and it wasn't. Yeah, I don't know. I've kind of lost my train of thought. But
I think it really is unique for Europe and for Scotland. Just to put it in perspective, in the beginning of the 18th century, there were, I think, roughly 1 million, and the population of 1 million in Scotland. In Denmark, we were a little less than that, but not that much. So we were not that different from Scotland. We were arguably much closer to what was going on in Europe. But then you have it, the Scottish Enlightenment just comes out.
It's remarkable. It's remarkable, and it seems like there was some dynamic also with the religious groups, the Presbyterians, the Catholics, and some of the lowlanders like Smith, who were were strong Presbyterians in their upbringing and everything. They kind of figured that we want to integrate into a better but more cosmopolitan British culture. They were speaking, they kind of had the point of view of the periphery rather than the center. And so they had these kind of different ways of seeing things, and they did a good job. There's also my third favorite 18th century thinker, I think, is Edmund Burke. And he's another, I think, star. Now, he's somewhat different because he's very much more of a politician. But he's from Ireland. So he's also from the periphery.
Yeah.
There's something to be said from, an outside point of view.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. So when we went out to lunch, there was some debate around deitism around the table and God and so on. And I think right now, to the audience, you have a Christian, an agnostic, and an atheist around this table, I think, right? So we can take all sides on this. Not mentioning who is who. However, is Smith a Christian? You mentioned his Presbyterian upbringing, but that's probably more of a nurture kind of argument, because as far as I know, he never really mentions God, right? And he was friends with Hume. He mentioned creator. He mentions nature with a capital N. But was he a believer in any kind of Christian doctrine? What do you say? Because I know this is a point of contention among Smith
This
scholars.
is one of the wonderful mysteries about Smith.
Yeah.
He really was very Sphinx-like in a lot of these important questions. He does clearly, explicitly affirm divine providence in this book.
In Moral Sentiments.
So it's not as though he entirely skated around the issue or sounded always like an agnostic or something. But there are questions about sort of how sincere that is. There's issues about how things were revised. There's also issues about, well, gee, how come there's so little and almost nothing? There's a couple of things in here. In fact, the invisible hand passage in here is significant as a potentially theistic statement. So he could be. Let's put four options on the table. It could be an atheist. He could be an agnostic. He could be a deist. He could be a Christian. And I don't know. I'm agnostic on this question.
All right. So my argument is, I'll take the Christian point of view here. And we talked about this, so you know what I'm going with this. I'm currently reading C.K. Lewis's Mere Christianity, which is, I think, is a wonderful book. Everybody should pick that up here around Christmas. And in that, one of the many arguments he makes is saying that God gives us free will so we can act morally, right? And that is basically the same argument that Smith has, right? Moral Sentiments. You become a moral creature because you have free will, right? Which I would argue makes him a fundamental Christian, at least in mindset.
He's definitely presupposing that we make choices, and we, in a sense, choose how seriously or even whether to pursue virtue.
Yeah, exactly.
So I see that. He doesn't talk a whole lot about free will. He doesn't make that an issue or even a thing. No. It's not like the words even show up, as it were.
But that's exactly my point. He takes it as granted. This is what man is, right? I mean, and that would make him, at least in a Lewisian sense, very Christian, right? Yeah.
Fine. Yeah. I mean, I think that all works.
Yeah.
He's
we'll
clearly,
see what the floor has to say about this.
He's addressing us and talking about us as moral agents, people with responsibility, people with duties to the impartial spectator, to God.
But of course, the interesting question is, where does the impartial spectator come from? Who is it? If it's not Santa Claus, it could be God, or it could be the idea among people that there is a God, even if Smith doesn't believe in it, or Smith could believe that the impartial spectator was instituted by God, by the creation of the world, and then he has left the world to itself in the hands of the impartial spectator.
Right.
So that would be a theist interpretation, perhaps, but it could also be a creation of evolution, perhaps, and I guess that would be.
I agree.
Would be Hume's point. If he had a point on the impartial spectator,
Yeah, and I
he was an atheist clearly.
I
don't
wouldn't
think
say
so?
that. I would put him in the agnostic category,
Okay.
actually.
Really?
Yes,
Oh,
really.
I-
You know, really. And that's right. It could be that we aren't here from divine providence. Don't ask me where we came from. I mean, it's not like anyone has a better answer, but we're here, and that we have evolved these ideas, and these ideas have been selected for ideas. That is to say, these ideas of a superior being in these godlike ways. There's a lot to be said for thinking along these ways. In fact, I think proper ethics, as he develops, you can be a non-theist and sign on to his ethics quite thoroughly.
That is true. Yeah, that is true.
And
yeah.
that's my. I mean, again, I'm agnostic, so I hope there's God, and I hope it's as advertised. And believe me, I'm like very much like pro Christianity. So to me, it's not the issue is for me the effort, the agenda is not to kind of promote agnosticism over theism. Actually, it's to kind of put these together as allies against a kind of anti-religious view. Because I think proper ethics is patterned after benevolent monotheism. And that and you should really take the whole structure of theology, of religion, seriously. To do ethics properly.
Yeah.
And a lot of people in the 19th, 20th century moved very much away from that. And I think that's a big part of our problems, actually.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Do you want to ask the next one? Because I want to jump to something else, but if you want to continue here.
Yeah, no, I think it would also perhaps we move
Okay.
on. It's could fill an entire series.
On this.
But perhaps I would like to ask you about the political philosophy of Smith. He was a proponent of what he called the system of natural liberty, and he was in the core of that is the what you call, I guess, the presumption of liberty.
Yeah,
And
that works. And he also spoke of the liberal plan. He and a couple of his Scottish friends christened this political philosophy liberal. That was the first time the word liberal took on a political meaning. So that's the original political liberal. Liberalism 1.0 was Smithian liberalism. That's why we keep saying classical liberalism. Like classical music. About the same time. So yes, he's got this strong sense of, as he puts it, allowing every man to pursue his own interest, his own way, upon the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. And in the System of Natural Liberty paragraph, he speaks also of people pursuing their own interests their own way, as long as they don't mess with other people's stuff, their neighbor's stuff. And he's very much asserting that as a presumption. That's not to say that there are never exceptions. You know, a presumption is a starting point. It places the burden of proof on the person who wants to contravene the principle, just like the presumption of innocence, right? It doesn't say that everyone's innocent, like necessarily innocent, but it says it's up to the prosecution to prove his case of guilt. And so he does make exceptions. So you know, it's a organizing principle, the presumption of liberty, and he makes a very strong case for why that should be a presumption. So that's his general view. I think he's generally very skeptical of government, of the governmentalization of social affairs. That's intervention. That's also big government players. I think he would be pretty shocked by our big government players in society. So much is governmentalized in ways which I don't know if he foresaw. Yeah, and that's his view, but he does make exceptions. But he takes liberty seriously. And the liberty part, by the way, is kind of a flip side of one of the virtues, and a very special virtue, justice. In fact, what he calls commutative, a narrow sense of justice, and that's not messing with your neighbor's person, property, and promises due. Like if you owe him 10 pounds today, you should pay it. So very narrow, grammar-like sense of justice. Liberty then becomes the government not messing with my stuff. Just like the virtue here was mine, not messing with my neighbor's stuff. And that whole thing about the justice, that comes out of the jurisprudence, which is very important, because they had to work out this whole idea of not messing and stuff. That's not simple, and that's part of this arc, I would say. So the jurisprudence is also a very important element in this whole phenomenon, I would say.
I think also many interesting things. I think some of the most entertaining bits in Smith is when he's trying to work out this, right? Like, for instance, he talks about the Lord sitting alone in the drafty castle, throwing chicken bones on the floor and all that kind of stuff, right? So I like that. But going back to how he actually suggests how to do policy, because he do have actual policy suggestions, right?
Yeah.
So one of the ones that I think is always funny is he worries that people get a proper education so they can function in the marketplace and be moral beings. But he worries that if the government is involved in this, the government will try to change people into whatever the government wants. So his suggestion is the government should fund the school buildings, but every teacher should be an entrepreneur brought in by the parents. What are your favorite still relevant policy suggestions of Smith today, if you were to pick one or two?
Oh, I mean, I like the liberty part.
Yeah, obviously. But
so that's the broad presumptive part. The exceptions are interesting and curious, and those rich discussions, which we debate a lot in Smith scholarship. I think the interpretations of Smith on schooling are open.
Yeah,
it's much more equivocal than I think a lot of people say. If you look at the final words he says on this topic, here I'm going to use one of these. Let's see if I can. I'm pretty sure I can do this. Yes. This is the final sentence.
impressive.
This is the final sentence.
And we're looking at Wealth of Nations.
He
now.
writes on the topic of the funding of schooling. This expense, that is, paying the costs of schooling for young people, this expense, however, might perhaps with equal propriety and even with some advantage be defrayed altogether by those who receive the immediate benefit of such education and instruction, or by the voluntary contribution of those who think they have occasion for either the one or the other. And what he has here in mind with voluntary contribution is charity schools. And they were doing schooling in the age of benevolence through subscription charities. And so what he's saying is the families, the parents, and others in the community who think they have a benefit from people getting. So he's saying maybe it's equally proper and even advantageous to come all together through voluntary financing. That sentence has been curiously omitted from a lot of scholars' work.
Well, that's another interesting thing about Adam Smith, by the way. Always read the whole paragraph, right? Like the one about the butcher, the one about people of the same trade, seldom coming together, even for merriment, without conspiracy. Always remember what he goes on to say, right? That simply just shouldn't be necessary nor prohibited in a free society, right? He goes on to say that. We also have, that's a really important thing when reading Smith, is to read the whole thing, right?
Yeah, and he left these different remarks and sentences that seem contrary, so you have to put it all together. It's a little bit like the Bible.
Yeah.
Like everyone can draw their bits and make their case. But that, again, is part of his whole rhetorical strategy of engaging you and challenging you.
But couldn't it also have to do with something else? And I get this feeling when I'm reading The Wealth of Nations that there's a lot of second best arguing in it, in the sense that he is not only proposing what he he prefers, but also discussing if you want
Yeah.
to do this X, then you should do it in this way. You should take this into consideration. I mean, this is a lot of us who are working as economists. I think
Yeah.
it's very familiar to us
Yeah.
that we can engage things that we don't really prefer, but we're constrained by somebody else's preferences. This is where you should do it, and I guess I get this feeling when I read Adam Smith, and I think this perhaps underlying a lot of there's some revisionism going on about Smith, and that a lot of scholars have been trying to find another Adam Smith or socialist Adam Smith or
Yeah.
whatever, and that they're really
Yeah.
they're picking out phrases which are really second best proposing.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree with you. The schooling topic,
Yep.
I think he's talking about a number of possible ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
And it's not just the funding. He also talks about a couple of other ideas like requiring people who want to have an office or trade or position in the community, even a business, to pass an exam.
Yeah.
To show that you can read and write and do math at a certain level. He's not saying the government should even provide it or fund it or anything, but he's doing something that will induce a demand. Now, it is restrictive.
Yeah,
it is
yeah.
an exception, but that's one thing he puts on the table. So, and in taxation, I think that's a very good example where it's second best arguments a lot of the time. Because what are you going to, what's the best way to extract money from people?
Awesome. All right, so let's move on to something else. So other modern Smith scholars like Vernon Smith and Bart Wilson and so on, they have argued that the theory of moral sentiment is actually sort of preemptive, right, of behavioral economics in many ways. They say you find something like loss aversion in there, for instance, and other things, and they have to some degree proven that with experiments and so on. So do you buy that? Like, is this actually, we've talked about the theory of moral sentiment as a philosophical work, but they would argue it's an economic work for that reason, right? Do you buy that? Do you agree?
I do. I certainly I do. Again, moral philosophy encompasses the social sciences and humanities, including economics, including psychology. So yes, it's definitely a psychology, a moral psychology, and some of the behavioral findings are along those lines, like loss aversion, which is the idea that losses loom larger than gains.
Yeah.
That's a very big theme.
It's a big theme in moral sentiments.
yes.
Very big theme. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, one way to think of this is, these great scientists, in the latter part of the 20th century came up and showed these ideas. And look, if you read the literature, there were these guys back then who had hints of it. And so they're precursors to the real science. And I think in a way that turns things upside down and that we kind of, like Smith, I think, had just a better, richer understanding of human beings, as like the whole shebang, and that was all part of it. And then people developed flatter ideas of human existence, and the flat ideas crashed and burned. And then people said, oh, no, we're not so flat. And look, we have loss aversion. And that was like an exciting discovery. So it kind of felt like this is, so like Smith and Burke and Hume are up here, and they die. And so now we're down here. I mean, people like them. And then things are going like this, and then like, oh, look, this isn't good, and so these guys do this and that.
Yeah.
And Hayek comes along and spontaneous order. And it's kind of like, yeah, guys.
Yeah. So we should just stop our ideas in the 17th century. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
18th.
Yeah, I think 18th is kind of this crest for
Yeah.
me personally. I think that.
Very cool. I do have one question we haven't prepared, but do you have more, Otto, before I ask that one? All right.
Go ahead.
So going back to Smith as a person,
Uh-huh.
he never married. right? Do you think he was ever in love, and do you think he understood what love was
Um,
on a personal level?
yeah, I think so. As well as any of us do. I suppose. There's a paper called Adam Smith in Love. It's in Econ Journal Watch. It's a very good paper. I think Smith did have romantic relationships. And if you ask me, well, does that mean sexually romantic relationships? I don't think we know.
No.
It's quite possible. And there are a number of hints and pieces of evidence and so on. But again, he's like a remarkably private guy. It's clear that he doesn't have any major ongoing. That's clear.
Yeah.
I'd say. Yeah. But some of these hints and stuff do indicate things that, you know, sound like a real romantic relationship. You could look at that nice piece.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Okay.
Perfect. So we're a little ahead of time, but I think we should open up for questions now. So anybody who has a question, please raise your hand. Remember again the rules: state your name and that a question ends with a question mark, right? And yes, we'll go around with the, right? Yeah, we have one down there.
Thank you very much for an entertaining discussion. My name is Niels Brünemann, and I would like to ask you about the term pursuit of own interest and link it to the US Constitution. Now, given you're American, so maybe you would like to help us connect the dots between pursuit of own interest and pursuit of happiness as it's phrased in the US Constitution. Did the founding fathers actually know Adam Smith? I know he lived long enough to experience the U.S. being founded, but did they know him, or did they know his thinking?
Yeah, they certainly did. So the expression that I've been using, and this is not an expression that's in Smith, is the pursuit of honest income, not own income, the pursuit of honest income. As opposed to dishonest income, which he's not endorsing. Yeah, so your question about the pursuit of honest income is how that relates to the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. I think for absolutely the folks of the colonies knew of Smith, and I think liked Smith, and we're very much on the same page as Smith. It's plausible, you know, this came out, this first came out in 1759, and this first came out in March of 76, so a few months before the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776. And he says really interesting things about the American problem, the American conflict. And he's very much in the kind of let him go camp. He is. As is Burke and Hume was. Hume died in 1776, but he too was in that camp. A number of people were in that camp. So I think the words in the preamble of the Declaration, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are really, it's really a great formulation. And the way I like to put it is, life and liberty are very much this presumption of liberty thing.
Yeah.
It's about, and those are sort of like securing and allowing the lower things in life, like don't mess with my person, don't mess with my property, life, liberty. Liberty's like includes protecting property, promises do, like I said. So getting that basic grammar right so that people can pursue the higher things.
Yeah.
Those are lower things. And this is part of this whole shift in these centuries from government in traditional society, say before the printing press, having led and tended the higher things, which is what some people want government to be again, which is a big mistake. To this liberal arc, where it says government should focus on securing and guaranteeing the lower things, kind of like an operating system, like a grammar. And then people, we got a grammar, you got a blank page and a pen, you fill up the piece of paper with your life.
Yeah.
The pursuit of happiness. And pursuing honest income would just be one aspect of any such pursuit. And for some people it might be a focus, and some people it might not. So I wouldn't put it closely, identify it with pursuit of happiness.
There were, if I can add a little bit, even though it's your nation's history, if I can add a little bit. So there were several things. We knew quite well what the founding fathers read, because many libraries were private businesses, so we can actually check how many books and which book were checked out by who to a fairly large extent. And there were discussion around that time as to whether it should say happiness. So other alternatives, as I remember, it's been a while since I read this, so please correct me, but other alternatives was, for instance, purpose, pursuit of purpose. But that was felt to be too religious. And another thing was pursuit of charity, right? That actually you should become rich enough that you can give to other people. That was actually a debate that was in the Federalist, right, as I remember. And another thing that's also very important to understand as us Europeans is like let them go camp, right? Is that the American colonists considered themselves English. They thought the revolution was happening in Parliament because Parliament wanted to introduce taxes without representation, right? So we say the American Revolution, we think it's a matter of breaking free from the empire. If you ask the people back then, they would think the revolution was happening in Westminster, right? Right. So
I follow you.
Yeah. So I think that's also an important part of that, right? And then they get rid of the sovereign. They don't know what to do. George Washington turns down to become new sovereign, and then what are you supposed to do? How do you redesign government, right? It's a brilliant piece of work, that contract. Like, it's brilliantly thought through, right? And
the Constitution.
Both the Constitution, but also the Declaration of Independence, right? I think there's a lot of thought that's gone into that, and a lot of debate. So it's an interesting question, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. You. Who's next? Yep. Okay, yeah, det styrer du. Du er så moderne, yes.
Yes, so my name's Cecilia Malou, and in relation to welfare, or not really welfare as such, but you were talking about the rich being supposed to give to the poor. And I read a paper where he said that he believed that this would be that rich would be paying out of status to feel more respected, perhaps. And I was thinking, did he believe this would be durable in the long run, or did he ever consider how this worked in the Roman Empire, as an example, where the people who were leading were actually giving out to the others?
Yeah.
Yes.
You want to feel this?
Yeah, I'm not sure I got all of that. So it's about Smith.
Smith believing that charity would be paid by the rich because it would be an indication of status. So as the rich got richer, they would give more to the poor because it was a way to indicate status, right? That's what you're saying. And to what degree would that be a viable system for welfare?
Yeah. I don't really recall him saying that about as a motive to charity. He's got status. He's got status considerations, very much so, in a lot of his works. But I don't remember that being specifically as a motive to charity. I think he is serious about wanting. This is a debate among Smith scholars, so people would disagree with me, but I don't think. Look, I think Smith is a pragmatic guy, first of all. We say he's got a presumption of liberty. He's also got a presumption of the status quo. And that's kind of his conservative side. It's part of his conservative side. And when you want to liberalize the status quo, that's in line with the presumption of liberty, but it's against the presumption of the status quo. So you have a conflict of presumptions then. And what do you do then? You have to kind of moderate the burden of proof either way. So the fact that, we have evolved to be welfare states, this is the point. We have a highly redistributive state now. he would accept that this is the status quo and it deserves a certain presumption. I don't think he would want to like tear it down or anything like that. But I do think his tendency is to go in the other direction, to reduce it. I don't think he's a radical, but I think he's a leaner, to put it mildly. Because I think he's serious about making a becoming use of one's own. That's distributive justice to him. It's not the state redistributing, it's Otto redistributing Otto's stuff. And this is an arena of virtue. It's Otto's whole arena of virtue. It's making and becoming use of what is our own. And so he's looking to see the institutions grow organically, just like the charity schools in his day, to do stuff. And rather than looking to the state, which is a very, very, where is the virtue? Where is the generosity in this system? If you look at it, is the taxpayer being generous? Is the tax collector being generous? Is the politician is the voter being generous? Is the recipient being virtuous? I mean, where is actually the virtue in this system? When you stop and think about it, I think he wants an organically virtuous system. And I don't think that's, So, and let me also just say one more thing on this topic of redistribution. I said this was quite comprehensive, but it's rather remarkable that there is one policy issue he does not address directly and weigh in on, and that's the poor laws. So he never endorses them, because they had local rates, local taxes for local poor relief in his day. That was part of his status quo. And it's really quite comprehensive in treating the important institutions of his status quo, but he doesn't address this one. So he doesn't endorse it and he doesn't denounce it.
See, this, before you come in, so I know you have a point, but I have a point specifically for this. Is this okay? Yeah. Because I think he doesn't do that for religious reasons, right? Because England used to do charity to the monasteries, then you had the Reformation, the monasteries were dissolved, and you had a big issue with how to do poor relief. And in fact, in the first official English translation of the Bible, and I love this anecdote, so those of you who know me have heard it before, I'm sorry, is that a big debate was how to translate the word grace. So the Protestants and the progressives of the time says it has to be grace. That's what it says in the Bible. God saves by grace. But the Catholics, conservatives says, no, it has to say charity. Otherwise, people will not give to the poor, right? So it has to say charity, right? So the poor, I think he's trying to steer out of a very heated, still at that point, debate by not commenting on the poor laws, because you are basically putting your finger right down in the question between Protestants and Catholics, right, again, because the poor laws was a compromise, basically, right?
Could be.
Yeah, that would be my take on that. Yeah.
Silence on the issue.
Yeah, it's because it was simply too heated, right?
It's possible.
Yeah. I have another observation which is a little bit related. Smith was very concerned with the welfare of ordinary people and the standard of living. So that was basically really a major concern. If you read The Wealth of Nations, it's a concern he's having constantly. But he's also an optimist, in the sense that he believed that the standard of living had been going up, and he expected it to continue to do so, much more than the other classical economists who followed him. Their economics was called the dismal science, because it often led to the opposite conclusion. But Smith was very concerned that the way to raise the standard of living was to have the system of natural liberty, and markets would do that. But saying that, I think he would have been really surprised if he had been alive today to see our standard of living, because he was. That's also important to remember. He was writing before the Industrial Revolution was really taking place, and what we've seen since then has been extraordinary in a sense. But actually, Smith he didn't anticipate the Industrial Revolution,
Yeah.
the enormous growth of standards of living, but he did expect it to improve steadily over time.
Yeah, that's right. The Deirdre McCloskey likes to draw GDP through history, and it's pretty flat, and then it starts going up a bit, and then it really goes like the blade of the hockey stick.
Yeah.
And this beginning is just Smith's time, and then it goes up wildly. And I would argue that it's because of his moral authorization of the pursuit of honest income, which also includes then God approves of innovation.
Yeah,
It's like a
very
green
important.
light to
Yeah, very
innovation,
important.
which has always been like a touchy subject in society in the long history. So it invigorates economic life, this green light to the pursuit of honest income, and saying to the lawmakers, let people pursue honest income. And they move more and more in that. They persuade, it's not just him, it's the age, it's just like all the American founders and so on. And so you get, a more free-rolling, free-rollicking, open economy, invigorated sense of this God approves of this, and you get the hockey stick bang.
Cool. We had I think the gentleman there has been waiting for a long time.
Thank you. My name is Martin Mosfeld. I read Wealth of Nations 45 years ago, and I liked it, and I've gone on with Schumpeter and Clayton Christensen and so on, so I'm pretty well off in that department. I never did read The Moral Sentiment, but I did read Ayn Rand. So I wonder, am I okay? Could you
No.
could you please compare and contrast Ayn Rand and Smith?
Yeah, I think much less of Ayn Rand as a moral philosopher. I mean, I generally agree with her general political policy position or posture, certainly. She wrote a book, for example, The Virtue of Selfishness.
Yeah.
Selfishness, especially in our day, kind of means too much, like it has that built into it. So she doesn't, I don't think she's got the same kind of depth and sense of moral life that Smith does at all. So I don't put her in this class at all. So I don't think it's at all comparable or an adequate substitute for the moral sentiments. No.
I think there's a difference in emphasis. So Ayn Rand puts the emphasis on selfishness, right? Whereas that's not the emphasis for Adam Smith. The emphasis on Adam Smith is that capitalism is a pro-social system that uses the fact that people have self-interest in order to make them work and create stuff that's relevant for other people, right? So his emphasis, and people like Voltaire in France or Simmel later on in Germany, George Simmel, who I can highly recommend reading, says capitalism is not about self-interest. It's actually about pro-social behavior motivated in a way where we can get people to do it in a voluntary way, which is consistent with liberty, right? Whereas we cannot get pro-social behavior in other ways that are...
Something else that you could maybe make a contrast between the two is that for Smith, wisdom and good moral judgment, again, actually always involves a sympathy. So,
Good point.
so things are always based on social influences and a social sense. And Rand looks more towards something that doesn't sound like that exactly, like reason, in a very kind of abstract, kind of glinty, different sense. So Smith has this way of seeing us as thoroughly social creatures, but he avoids the accusation of endorsing or believing in conformism, because he's saying that while sort of we have built ourselves from social influences, we get exposed to many social influences. and we take some to heart and some not. Some we push away and reject, and that's our own creation. So we are also judging what to put into our conscience, what to build our conscience from. And that whole sense in Smith, that what you're left with is still very much like a social education and a social belonging. Like, it's very contrary to Rand, I feel.
Yeah.
Just in spirit.
Maybe I could slightly disagree.
Mhm.
Slightly disagree. My reading of Rand is that she's not really as selfish as she proposes. She has the idea that she's rhetorically very strongly proposing selfishness as a virtue, but in her understanding, it has to be your true true selfishness, true self-interest, and that follows from your understanding, rational understanding of human nature. So you have you're sort of constrained by the insight of human nature, and you could argue that the human nature in her view is somewhat like the
Yeah, I mean, it's
spectator.
possible.
So there is a constraint,
But it's like she has to backpedal.
Yeah.
For her, it feels more like backpedaling to get to that same place. Whereas for Smith, it just feels more natural in the whole way he develops it.
That's a good point. My favorite Rand piece is Man's Rights, the essay where she goes into negative and positive rights, and that's exactly backpedaling, right? That's she's living in a world where people start to believe in positive rights, and now she's trying to argue against those. Whereas Smith sets out this basically from ground zero. This I think that's a good point.
Mhm.
Yeah. Next question. You decide. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Hi, my name is BJ Peterson. So you mentioned Hutcheson and Hume earlier. So how does Smith's concept of sympathy differ from the moral sense tradition from his contemporaries like Hutcheson and Hume?
Great question. This is, I think, where Smith is very original. Now, those guys also talked about sympathy. And what Smith did was make very, very central and develop in a very rich way a seat of sympathy that's not my workmates, sympathy between my workmates, sympathy with my family, sympathy with the stranger or the beggar, but a sympathy with my man within the breast. That's my conscience. So he actually takes sympathy inward, and it's through this kind of mechanism, this kind of idea, that he can sustain this principle that all moral judgment relates to a sympathy, because it might relate to a sympathy with my conscience, okay, which is built from, again, social influences. Maybe mom and dad are in there, so in a sense I'm sympathizing with something I've learned from them or their spirit or something. So he takes sympathy, he kind of enlarges sympathy and does more with it, and in a way generalizes it more. Now it becomes more allegorical. We have this man within the breast that I sympathize with, because sympathy involves, sharing sentiment with some other being, and he's saying that other being can be allegorical. It can be the man within the breast. It can be the impartial spectator. And that's why this is also how he turns all of this into kind of theological, because the man within the breast, again, is the representative, not necessarily a good representative of of God or the allegorical godlike being. So Smith, I think, takes the sympathy ideas, the moral sense Scottish thing, to new heights, in my view. And let me just make one other footnote. We think of this as the first book in 1759, but this is in a way also the last book, because the revision at the very end of his life is very significant, and it's in fact significant especially in some of these ways. So you got to almost think 1790 more as much when you think about this side of Smith.
But there was some beef between him and Hutchinson, right? Like Hutchinson thought he took so much from him, or how do you see that?
I think he loved Hutchison. Hutchison was a really wonderful person and an amazing person, I think. Hutchison, his written works are not that rewarding and not that worked out and careful, but he was a magnificent lecturer and teacher and a super dedicated teacher, and he did all sorts of incredible things for his students, like house them and lend them money and bring them over from Ireland. And I mean, this guy, and he was super charismatic, and he also imbued his students, people testify to this, with a sense of liberty, actually. So he's like a really great guy. He died rather young, I think at age 52, unfortunately, which is a great loss. But he talked a lot about sympathy, and he talked a lot about benevolence, and that went through revisions in Hutchison. But again, the text is not as...
No.
And you know, Hume is a very beautiful, and he perfected his texts right to the end of his life. So Hume's texts are magnificent. So Hutchison's a little different in terms of a source.
All right, lovely. Let's get somebody from over here now. So yeah, you. The gentleman in the brown blazer. Sorry. There.
My name is Carl Kehler, and I would like to I would like to ask you the following. On the one hand,
Then
I
that's
think
it.
it is on.
Yeah.
okay, I'll try again then. On the one hand, we have Smith and his sympathy, which we all think is a very moral sentiment. On the other hand, we have hatred. We have an immoralism dating back to Hegel, and we find it on the left hand or the left side, a hatred against the liberal world. Now, I have heard what you have said, but I would like to ask you, from a modern Smithsonian point of view, how do you interpret that hatred towards the liberal world? Which is, I mean, something we faces almost every day. And on the big scale, we have it on the one hand, Russia and China, on the other hand, the West. And hatred is certainly something which has been a main theme within almost 200 years. Goes back to Hegel. His analysis...
Goes back to Hegel?
Hegel, yes, the German philosopher Hegel, and was adopted by Marx. Went on, and you know probably well that his companion or friend Engels said that we don't get a fair world until we have extinguished he called it the reactionary world, we would call it the liberal world. So Hegel expressed said we have in a third world war which should extinguish every reactionary people on this planet. So I'd like to know what you, from a modern Smithsonian point of view, how do you how do you value or how do you judge that? Is it a sane reaction to an insane world, or is it an insane reaction to a sane world, to put it shortly?
It could be an insane reaction to an insane world. Yeah. So let me first say that I wouldn't like contrast and pit hatred against sympathy. That's not the way it works in Smith. And hatred's a sentiment, but sympathy is not actually not so much a sentiment, but it's about a sharing of sentiment. And it could be sharing of hatred, which then makes it the hatred that we share sympathetic between us. And for Smith, it's not so much that some people sympathize and some people don't. It's more about what people sympathize with. So he kind of sees everybody as sympathizing with something. And often they're sympathizing with the wrong things in his view. And I think he would think that a lot of people who want to destroy the liberal world are doing just that. So hatred is not to be pitted against Smithian systems. It's clearly in Smith's system. In fact, and there's a wonderful quote from him on this. He says, "Those who do not hate what they ought to hate will not love what they ought to love," which is very true. No, I mean, look, there's different ways. I mean, hatred is a different kind of sympathy. It's what he calls an unsocial passion, because it divides sympathies. It divides sentiments between the hated and the hater, as opposed to love, where it's more like we can all just have a love fest, because the lover and the loved, you can befriend both, but you can't befriend both the hater and the hated. So you do have to do those kinds of passions differently. So I'm not saying they're just like, but still, Burke is right. Those who do not hate what they ought to hate will not love what they ought to love. So the idea of like driving hatred from our moral system is foolish, in my view. And it's false and fraudulent in terms of the people who pretend to want to do that, in my view. They actually just want to be able to call certain things hate, dub them hate, and censor them, in my view, just like with and disinformation. And those people are at war with liberalism. And that is a very big problem. And I think Smith would see it as a very big problem and be very much opposed to them. He might even hate them. Whether they're hate-worthy, I guess is another issue. Or at least their ideas or their actions. Maybe we don't want to say their souls. Maybe all souls are beautiful, but souls and persons are not exactly the same thing necessarily. So anyway, yeah, what do we do about this? Or what, I've thought a lot about this. Has Smith discussed this kind of widespread cultural rejection and hatred of the liberal order, if you will, which is what we face and have faced for a long time. I would say it especially came in during started up in the 19th century. I mean, I think people like Rousseau represent it even back then. I think he is that. Rousseau. I'm very anti-Rousseau. And so I don't think these guys were innocent of that outlook. They could see it in Rousseau. And in subtle ways, you might say they even responded to him. But they didn't see the full-on attitude and the full-on social phenomena that we have seen. And that's all part of unfolding history with the French Revolution and throughout. And then really with the collapse of liberalism, I would say, at the end of the 19th century, when young people stopped being raised up in kind of liberal ideas. And then the horrible 20th century, when the creations of anti-liberalism did what they did, which was absolutely horrible. Yeah, so I don't think he certainly didn't address this in a large way, because he didn't see it in a large way. And I'm not sure how much you could say he and Hume anticipated it. You know who did is Tocqueville.
Yeah.
And Alexis de Tocqueville.
Democracy in America.
Yeah, and he very much diagnoses this and warns us that this is coming and happening. And he foresees possibly very, very bad things.
In fact, you could argue probably, and please, if you disagree, that Smith would allow people to hate other groups as long as they didn't have the power of the state to destroy the basic presumption of liberty, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can be in a community and say that other communities are weird or don't believe in the same thing or whatever, just don't dress the right way. But as long as they don't have power to actually hurt those people, that is still fine by Smith, right? That will be.
That's right. It's pure sentiment is not actionable.
Exactly.
I mean, when it get, there's lines to draw here with abating or inciting things, but pure sentiment is not actionable. This goes back to some of the jurisprudence. No, we got to keep it grammar-like, that is to say, precise and accurate, because otherwise we're going to be at each other's throats about these speculations
of other people.
Yeah.
Cool. Next, we have a couple more. Yeah, that's over there.
Bright young people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. See if we can top the other question.
Thank you. My name is Theodore, and I was wondering, when you mentioned the importance of including theology when discussing moral value, does it mean that you believe that society is controlling the moral values that we as individuals follow through religion? And I'm actually quite interested in both your points of view as well as your interpretation of Smith's perspective.
I think I said that thinking about the theology or the religious pattern of thought, the religious doctrine even, when doing moral philosophy, moral theory is good and should be joined. Again, because I think that proper moral theory is very much patterned after and has all sorts of things to take on board and take seriously, treating a lot of what's theistic in religion as perhaps kind of allegorical, and which you can be agnostic about. And so there's like a lot there that is I believe in. I mean, and believe me, most of my students, my PhD students, are Christian, and I look up to them like so much. I was like a really ill-bred, like non-religious, so I kind of migrated in all of this. So there's just so much in, if you like, theological moral psychology that has to be adopted, imported, in my view, for good moral theory. Notions like just the whole kind of rubric of repentance, attrition, atonement, for example, reconstruction. I mean, just anything almost, because it's the same pattern, and the whole idea of us being fallen, I think, is great. I do think we're, and this, fits an evolutionary perspective. We're kind of these, beasts, and it's all about culture. Culture is the way human society adapts and improves, and it's like he taught, Burke, it's very much about our responsibility to preserve what's good and so on, and not just to preserve it. You preserve it also by correcting it and changing it. He understood that it's not an anti-reform, because the world keeps changing and your understanding of things keep changing. So actually making changes is part of preservation. So yeah.
Do you want our opinions as well? Okay, yeah. Do you want to go first, also?
No,
all right. So I think one of the greatest gifts of Christianity is the fact that it was written by man, and because it's written by man, you can discuss it. You're welcome to discuss it. It's not written by God, so you can actually question it, and that has left to immense positive social development in the Western world, and it's a relatively unique religion in that sense. So, for instance, we can find analogies in the Bible that states that women are, of course, equal to men, right? Which is actually hard to do in other ones, and of course we can debate whether that's what they say. So the analogy, for instance, of the woman touching the cape of Jesus, because that can be, without going into a whole discussion here, being interpreted in a way saying that Jesus says that women, even when they have their period, is of course as pure as men are. Whereas other religions, if they're written by God and it says that men are superior to women, you're stuck with that horrible idea, right? So having a religious foundation that you can debate is extremely important for social development. So without even going into whether you believe in God and all that stuff, that is a genius invention that we are blessed with. And you can say that blessing maybe comes from God. I don't know. But
I just want to add, I realize I said attrition when I meant contrition. Maybe you understood that. By the way, another great thing about Christianity is that a good way to start a government skeptical religion is to have your Messiah
Being
tortured by government.
Exactly. All right, I think we have time for one more, the last one. There was one in the back down here.
It's up here, sorry.
All right, then we have
You
two,
said
because
I
you've
could-
been waiting for a
You
long
said
time.
I could choose.
Yeah, that's true, but he's been waiting for long. We'll do two. All right, Will's yours. Let's do both of them together, and then is that okay?
Yes. This is really an expansion of what you just talked about. You mentioned Burke as one of your great heroes from this same period, and of course he's the father of conservatism, which is about order and hierarchy, supposedly. But you seem to say they are much more related. Could you expand on the relationship on Burke and liberalism and conservatism?
I think Burke is a liberal.
No, let's get the other questions.
Oh,
for
I'm
him, and
sorry.
Yeah. So
But
the gentleman in the back, can you raise your hand?
Yeah.
So, you'll see. That's good. Remember to state your name.
and you need to keep the answers a little bit short in
Yeah,
interest of time, yeah?
People need their kleiner.
Well, I'm going to take you much in a similar direction, so it won't be a problem. Thank you all for an interesting discussion. I'm Balthasar Dudensborg, and I wanted to ask sort of your idea of Adam Smith as sort of the original liberal. So, as I understood your description of his view, liberty doesn't really seem to be sort of an end in and of itself, as it is for many other liberals of the period, right? It's an accessory, if you will, for virtue. And that places him outside of what I think is the best working definition of liberalism, which is that you have to self-identify as a liberal, at least to be a liberal. So I'm guessing sort of like, what does that mean for our way of understanding Adam Smith as a liberal if he didn't have liberalism or liberty as a goal in and of itself, and he didn't think of himself as a liberal either, and similarly people in the period didn't really seem to pick him up as one either. He was more like an economist to them.
Okay, we're ready?
Yeah, we're ready.
Smith saw the good of the whole as supreme, which was very natural to Christianity, and I think is a very natural thing to humankind generally. I don't think that's really what divides us. I don't really think that's the kind of thing that puts us into different political camps, ideological camps. What does is our ideas about how that is, what that consists of, the good of the whole, and how it is advanced. And that's where we see big differences in approaches to policy and politics. And that's where, like, I think liberal becomes meaningful. So I see him as liberal, even though he does not see liberty as supreme. He sees the good of the whole, of humankind, as supreme. And I think that's perfectly fine, and a fine way to...
Is that then the relationship to conservatism?
Burke is a liberal. Burke is a liberal. You can also say he's a conservative. I like to use conservative liberal. My friend Anders used liberal conservative in Sweden. But I like to make liberal the noun and conservative the modifier. So I say conservative liberal. Conservative liberalism.
Do you want to add something?
Yeah,
well? Then we finish up.
very much agree with that. That there's no contradiction between the liberalism and the conservatism, neither in Smith nor in Burke. The liberalism is sort of the core idea. The conservatism is about how you change society, and it's obvious that Smith is also a conservative in the sense that he wants gradual, cautious changes. So in that respect, they're both conservative and both liberal. But that, of course, is very different from other strands of conservatism, which could be authoritarian. The continental conservatism, to a much larger extent, is very much different from that. So I think that's important. I just one brief comment on the question of the centrality of liberty, and of course I think there is a point if liberty is a presumption, the next question is how do you evaluate? It is to be evaluated, but by what do you evaluate it, and where does the presumption come from? And that's of course where Smith is less clear, and that creates some of the problems that he's avoiding in the first place by making it a presumption, because it is a presumption.
Cool. So one contention between conservatism and liberalism is the influx of the great commercial society on community and culture over time. And we do not have time to go into that business right now, but listen to Blåt Bælte from today, and I talk a little bit about that. That's a wonderful radio show, so listen to that from today if you're interested. Thank you so much for coming. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan, for coming all the way to Denmark to have this talk. Thank you.